Machu Picchu is a 15th-century Inca citadel, located in the Eastern Cordillera of southern Peru, on a 2,430-meter (7,970 feet) mountain ridge. It is located in the Machupicchu District within Urubamba Province above the Sacred Valley, which is 80 kilometers (50 miles) northwest of Cuzco. The Urubamba River flows past it, cutting through the Cordillera and creating a canyon with a tropical mountain climate. For most speakers of English or Spanish, the first C in Picchu is silent. In English, the name is pronounced M2Pi2 or M2Pi-K2, in Spanish as Machu Picchu or Machu Picchu, and in Quechua, Machu Picchu, as map parked. Most archaeologists believe that Machu Picchu was constructed as an estate for the Inca Emperor Pachacuti, 1438–1472. Often mistakenly referred to as the lost city of the Incas, it is the most familiar icon of Inca civilization. The Incas built the estate around 1450 but abandoned it a century later at the time of the Spanish conquest. Although known locally, it was not known to the Spanish during the colonial period and remained unknown to the outside world until American historian Hiram Bingham brought it to international attention in 1911. Machu Picchu was built in the classical Inca style, with polished dry stone walls. Its three primary structures are the Interwatana, the Temple of the Sun, and the Room of the Three Windows. Most of the outlying buildings have been reconstructed in order to give tourists a better idea of how they originally appeared. By 1976, 30% of Machu Picchu had been restored and restoration continues. Machu Picchu was declared a Peruvian Historic Sanctuary in 1981 and a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1983. In 2007, Machu Picchu was voted one of the new 7 wonders of the world in a worldwide internet poll. Etymology. In the Quechua language, Machu means old or old person, while Picchu means either portion of coca being chewed or pyramid, pointed multi-sided solid cone. Thus the name of the site is sometimes interpreted as Old Mountain. History. Machu Picchu is believed by Richard L. Berger to have been built in the 1450s. Construction appears to date from 2 great Inca rulers, Pachacutec Inca Yupanqui, 1438–1471, and Tupac Inca Yupanqui, 1472–1493, XXXV. There is a consensus among archaeologists that Pachacutec ordered the construction of the royal estate for himself, most likely after a successful military campaign. Though Machu Picchu is considered to be a royal estate, surprisingly, it would not have been passed down in the line of succession. Rather it was used for 80 years before being abandoned, seemingly because of the Spanish conquests in other parts of the Inca Empire. It is possible that most of its inhabitants died from smallpox introduced by travelers before the Spanish conquistadors arrived in the area. Daily life in Machu Picchu. During its use as a royal estate, it is estimated that about 750 people lived there, with most serving as support staff, Yanaconas, Yana, page needed, who lived there permanently. Though the estate belonged to Pachacutec, religious specialists and temporary specialized workers, Mayocs, lived there as well, most likely for the ruler's well-being and enjoyment. During the harsher season, staff dropped down to around 100 servants and a few religious specialists focused on maintenance alone. Studies show that according to the skeletal remains, most people who lived there were immigrants from diverse backgrounds. They lacked the chemical markers and osteological markers they would have if they had been living there their whole lives. Instead, there was bone damage from various species of water parasites indigenous to different areas of Peru. There were also varying osteological stressor and varying chemical densities suggesting varying long-term diets characteristic of specific regions that were spaced apart. These diets are composed of varying levels of maize, potatoes, grari. Bingham was a lecturer at Yale University, although not a trained archaeologist. In 1909, returning from the Pan American Scientific Congress in Santiago, he traveled through Peru and was invited to explore the Inca ruins at Cocaquairu in the Apuimac Valley. He organized the 1911 Yale Peruvian expedition in part to search for the Inca capital, which was thought to be the city of Vitcos. He consulted Carlos Romero, one of the chief historians in Lima, who showed him helpful references, and Father Antonio de la Calancha's Chronicle of the Augustinians. In particular, Ramos thought Vitcos was near a great white rock over a spring of fresh water. Back in Cusco again, Bingham asked planters about the places mentioned by Calancha, particularly along the Urubamba River. According to Bingham, one old prospector said there were interesting ruins at Machu Picchu, though his statements were given no importance by the leading citizens. Only later did Bingham learn that Charles Wiener also heard of the ruins at Huayna Picchu and Machu Picchu, but was unable to reach them. Armed with this information, the expedition went down the Urubamba River. En route, Bingham asked local people to show them Inca ruins, especially any place described as having a white rock over a spring, 137. At Manda Pampa, Bingham asked farmer and innkeeper Melchor Artiga if he knew of any nearby ruins. Artiga said he knew of excellent ruins on the top of Huayna Picchu. The next day, the 24th of July, Artiga led Bingham and Sergeant Carrasco across the river on a log bridge and up the Machu Picchu site. At the top of the mountain, they came across a small hut occupied by a couple of Quechua, Richard and Alvarez, who were farming some of the original Machu Picchu agricultural terraces that they had cleared 4 years earlier. Alvarez's 11-year-old son, Pueblato, led Bingham along the ridge to the main ruins. The ruins were mostly covered with vegetation except for the cleared agricultural terraces and clearings used by the farmers as vegetable gardens. Because of the vegetation, Bingham was not able to observe the full extent of the site. He took preliminary notes, measurements, and photographs, noting the fine quality of Inca stonework of several principal buildings. Bingham was unclear about the original purpose of the ruins, but decided that there was no indication that it matched the description of Vitco's, 141, 186 to 187. The expedition continued down the Urubamba and up the Vilcabamba rivers, examining all the ruins they could find. Guided by locals, Bingham rediscovered and correctly identified the site of the old Inca capital, Vitco's, then called Rosaspata, and the nearby temple of Chuquipalta. He then crossed a pass and into the Pampacanas Valley, where he found more ruins heavily buried in the jungle undergrowth at Espiritu Pampa, which he named Trombone Pampa. As was the case with Machu Picchu, the site was so heavily overgrown that Bingham could only note a few of the buildings. In 1964, Jean Savoy further explored the ruins at Espiritu Pampa and revealed the full extent of the site, identifying it as Vilcabamba Viejo, where the Incas fled after the Spanish drove them from Vitco's. Bingham returned to Machu Picchu in 1912 under the sponsorship of Yale University and National Geographic again, and with the full support of Peruvian President Leguía. The expedition undertook a 4-month clearing of the site with local labor, which was expedited with the support of the prefect of Cuzco. Excavation started in 1912 with further excavation undertaken in 1914 and 1915. Bingham focused on Machu Picchu because of its fine Inca stonework and well-preserved nature, which had lain undisturbed since the site was abandoned. None of Bingham's several hypotheses explaining the site held up. During his studies, he carried various artifacts back to Yale. One prominent artifact was a set of 15th-century, ceremonial Incan knives made from bismuth bronze. They are the early. The guardhouse is a 3-sided building, with one of its long sides opening onto the terrace of the ceremonial rock. The 3-sided style of Inca architecture is known as the Huayrona style. In 2005 and 2009, the University of Arkansas made detailed laser scans of the entire site and of the ruins at the top of the adjacent Huayna Picchu mountain. The scan data is available online for research purposes. Temple of the Sun or Torian. This semicircular temple is built on the same rock overlying Bingham's Royal Mausoleum, and is similar to the Temple of the Sun found in Cusco and the Temple of the Sun found in Pisac, in having what Bingham described as a parabolic enclosure wall. The stonework is of ashlar quality. Within the temple is a 1.2 meters by 2.7 meters rock platform, smooth on top except for a small platform on its southwest quadrant. A serpent's door faces 340 degrees, or just west of north, opening onto a series of 16 pools, and affording a view of Huayna Picchu. The temple also has 2 trapezoidal windows, one facing 65 degrees, called the solstice window, and the other facing 132 degrees, called the kulka window. The northwest edge of the rock platform points out the solstice window to within 2 of the 15th century June solstice rising sun. For comparison, the angular diameter of the sun is 32. The Inca constellation Kulka, storehouse, can be viewed out the Kulka window at sunset during the 15th century June solstice, hence the window's name. At the same time, the Pleiades are at the opposite end of the sky. Also seen through this window on this night are the constellations Clamignoran, Llama, Unalamasha, Machacue, and the star Pacapacarik Chaska, Canopus. Interwatana Stone. The Interwatana Stone is one of many ritual stones in South America. These stones are arranged to point directly at the sun during the winter solstice. The name of the stone, perhaps coined by Bingham, derives from Quechua language. Inti means sun, and wata, to tie, hitch, up. The suffix na derives nouns for tools or places. Hence Interwatana is literally an instrument or place to tie up the sun, often expressed in English as the hitching post of the sun. The Inca believed the stone held the sun in its place along its annual path in the sky. The stone is situated at 13 degrees 9 minutes 48 seconds south. At midday on the 11th of November and the 30th of January, the sun stands almost exactly above the pillar, casting no shadow. On the 21st of June, the stone casts the longest shadow on its southern side, and on the 21st of December a much shorter shadow on its northern side. Inti Machi and the Royal Feast of the Sun. Inti Machi is a special cave used to observe the Royal Feast of the Sun. This festival was celebrated during the Incan month of Capac Rami. It began earlier in the month and concluded on the December solstice. On this day, noble boys were initiated into manhood by an ear-piercing ritual as they stood inside the cave and watched the sunrise. Architecturally, Inti Machi is the most significant structure at Machu Picchu. Its entrances, walls, steps, and windows are some of the finest masonry in the Incan Empire. The cave also includes a tunnel-like window unique among Incan structures, which was constructed to allow sunlight into the cave only during several days around the December solstice. For this reason, the cave was inaccessible for much of the year. Inti Machi is located on the eastern side of Machu Picchu, just north of the Condor Stone. Many of the caves surrounding this area were prehistorically used as tombs, yet there is no evidence that Machi was a burial ground. Construction. The central buildings use the classical Inca architectural style of polished dry stone walls of regular shape. The Incas were masters of this technique, called ashlar, in which blocks of stone are cut to fit together tightly without mortar. The site itself,